Canada's defense spending is coming under intense scrutiny in the United States. A U.S. senator delivered scathing remarks this week about Canada's defense commitments during a committee hearing.
The Wall Street Journal on July 12th had an editorial entitled "Canada is a military free rider in NATO." And it goes on to talk about Ottawa's feeble commitment to the alliance. At the Vilnius summit, they should have been put at the kids' table. Canada's not even close to its 2% commitment. And it was common knowledge that Prime Minister Trudeau was trying to water down the Vilnius commitment to 2% as a floor, all of which is incredibly disappointing.
That's U.S. Republican Senator Dan Sullivan questioning the next commander of NORAD. Sullivan is a member of the U.S. Senate Armed Services Committee, and Prime Minister Justin Trudeau was asked about those comments.
Whether it's 88 new fighter jets, whether it's NORAD modernization, whether it's the Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic in Halifax, whether it's the Centre for Climate Security, the NATO Centre for Climate Security in Montreal, we're going to continue to step up in this time of increased concerns around security everywhere around the world.
Senator Dan Sullivan joins me now. Senator, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, David. Thank you.
I want to start with your concerns over Canada's defense spending. We currently spend 1.4% roughly of GDP on defense, an amount you say is unacceptable. Why do you say that?
Yeah. Well, look, it's not just me. It's my constituents. It's several leaders that I had the opportunity to meet with in NATO. I was at the summit in Lithuania, and the goal for NATO, the minimum goal, by the way, is 2% of GDP. That's been a goal for many, many years, even before the Wales summit in 2014. And unfortunately, a lot of countries still are not meeting that number. And Canada actually has one of the lowest numbers. And, look, David, I say this as a friend, right? I'm Alaska's senator. You're our only neighbor, literally, if you don't include Russia. So I've always been a fan of Canada. I was actually in Normandy for the first time in my life last year, walking the beaches. You know, a lot of Americans know about Omaha Beach, Utah Beach. Not a lot of us know about Juneau Beach, right? So that was a heroic efforts, huge efforts by the Canadian military. But right now, to be frank, and I'm doing this as a friend, the effort by Canada is disappointing. The effort by the Prime Minister is disappointing. There was a Washington Post story a few weeks back saying the Prime Minister had said Canada never intends to hit 2%. And I will tell you this, that really, in my view, undermines the unity of a critical alliance like NATO. When American citizens, when Alaskan citizens see that other countries aren't pulling their weight, what they do is ask me and say, hey, Dan, why are we doing all the heavy lifting when some of our allies, particularly rich countries like Canada, are not doing it? So, I think Canada has a long way to go, and it's a lot of people who are making the case. And frankly, as a friend, strong friend of Canada, I think your leadership needs to do much better.
Okay, I just want to jump in there because you referenced the Washington Post report that was based on leaked U.S. intelligence that claims that the Prime Minister told NATO allies they wouldn't hit 2%. And you say this was raised, or at least concerns about defense spending was raised in NATO. Did anyone specifically raise with you that the Prime Minister said this, or tell you they saw it or heard it with their own ears?
I'm not going to, I mentioned that Washington Post story, whether or not that's true.
Right.
You can put that one aside. It's actually a good point. That was a story. And so let's not rely on that. What I did here at NATO, though, and I'm not going to name some of the leaders there, is that the Canadian delegation in Lithuania was trying to broaden the definition of defense spending, was resisting the 2% floor in the communique. So, yes, I heard that. Just 10 days ago from other NATO leaders, and that's a frustration. And, I don't think most Canadians are there. Most Canadians recognize you guys have benefited from NATO. We've all benefited from NATO, probably the most successful military alliance in history. but it needs to be sustained. And it needs to be sustained when people think that everybody's pulling their weight, everybody's paying a fair share. And right now, a lot of people don't think that's happening with regard to Canada.
Well, since the Wales summit that you mentioned, where 2% was set as a target, Canada has increased its defense spending by about 40%, and there is a plan to do it by about another 40% between now and 2027. So there is this commitment to an upward trajectory. Now, I know it will still fall short of 2%, but it gets to about 1.6, maybe a little bit over that. I mean, what do you say to at least that there is a trajectory going in the direction you're calling for?
Well, I think that's important. And one of the themes out of the Lithuanian or the summit in Lithuania was the positive momentum. But as you probably know, David, at the end of last year, the countries who hit 2%, it was 7 out of 31 countries. So I certainly acknowledge that it's not just Canada. That is a really low number. And as you mentioned, 10 years ago, the leaders of NATO said that they were going to get to 2% within 10 years. So that 10-year period is pretty much next year. So that has not happened at all. And I will tell you this, I'm a strong supporter of aid to Ukraine. And, we're having debates. As a matter of fact, we are debating the National Defense Authorization Act on the Senate floor right now as we speak. But I really do believe, and I made this point to every NATO leader I met at the summit 10 days ago, that if other countries are not meeting their NATO obligations, American citizens are increasingly asking, wait, why are we doing all the heavy lifting? We have obligations not just in Europe, but we have obligations in the Indo-PACOM theater. By the way, Canada does too as well. And, in the South China Sea and Taiwan Strait. And it really does, in my view, start to potentially not only undermine support for continued assistance to Ukraine, it has potential to undermine support for NATO. And we're going to celebrate 75 years next year with regard to the NATO alliance. I want it to be another 75 years, right? This is, again, one of the most successful alliances in history, but it can't be sustained if countries like mine don't believe that other countries are pulling their weight. This is why this is an important topic. It's about fairness. It's about burden sharing. And yes, I was calling out Canada, but I did it in a hearing where the NORTHCOM commander, also the NORAD commander, who works very closely with Canada, actually is nominated by the Prime Minister and the President, the only combatant commander in the U.S. system who's nominated by two leaders of two countries. But you may have seen, he committed to me during that confirmation hearing to have that tough conversation with Canadian leaders about, hey, it's important to meet your commitments. This is a commitment Canada's had for well over a decade, and it's not it's making some progress, but it needs to hit the number, not bounce around it below. That's my view. And again, we're friends, we're allies, especially up in Alaska. We're very close to Canada. It's a little bit of a tough love statement, I'll agree, but sometimes friends can deliver those kind of messages to their friends.
No, I can appreciate that. And also it's very clear you're a firm supporter of NATO, a firm supporter of Ukraine, but not every Republican is these days, right? I mean, I was in Brussels when Donald Trump was president, and he went to the NATO summit there and expressed his deep doubts in the potential of the alliance. He's threatened to pull out of it entirely. So what do you say to allies around the world who feel they kind of have to hedge their bets here because of what could happen if he's renominated and should he win as president, and American support is no longer guaranteed?
Well, look, I had several discussions with President Trump and on a whole host of foreign policy issues. I don't think he had any intention of pulling out of NATO. What he did do a very good job at, in my view, was doing what I have been talking about, not just on your program, but at the summit, which is getting countries to pay their fair share. And by the way, it's not just President Trump, who, like I said, made that a focus. It's President Biden. It's President Obama. It's George W. Bush. This has been a bipartisan endeavor for U.S. presidents across parties, across decades, And it's a sense of the frustration that Americans feel. As a U.S. Senator, I feel when my constituents who certainly raise this, Alaskans are, as you probably know, David, very pro-military. We have more veterans per capita than any state in the country. We have a huge military presence. As a matter of fact, the Alaska commander, that's a 3-star Air Force commander, his deputy is always a 1-star Canadian. So we have that integration in Alaska between the United States and Canada's militaries, probably more than most places. So again, this is a message that a bipartisan group of senators certainly sent to leaders in Lithuania just a couple of weeks ago. Mm-hmm. And presidents from George W. Bush on have made this a really important issue. And, you know, let's get back to the topic. No offense to our Canadian friends, they're not pulling their weight right now. And it's a frustration in the United States and certainly in the United States Senate.
Senator Dan Sullivan, I want to thank you for your time. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. Thanks very much.